Hey, what's up, guys? Back with the final video for Unit 1. You can see I got my background up here, RBG. We're going to talk a little bit about dissenting opinion in a case that you ruled on today. Um, Cover one other case, and then just touch on a few more ideas with federalism and the balance of power to kind of round out that big idea 4 from this unit. So, pulling up the review, couple cases that I want to talk about. I'll give you guys a few resources to review some of these Supreme Court cases. So yesterday, if you remember, we were talking a little bit about how the Constitution was purposely designed to achieve a balance of power between the national government or the federal government and the state government. And we see this in action a few times in some early court cases, both of which you do need to know. McCulloch versus Maryland, probably the more important of the two that we're going to talk about today. So, in McCulloch versus Maryland, this is early on, 1819. Congress creates the second bank of the United States. You might remember from U.S. history, we talked a little bit about Alexander Hamilton founding the first national bank. This is the second national bank, gets chartered, and Maryland, as a state, decides that they're going to impose a tax on the second bank of the United States. So, a state entity putting a tax on a federal entity in this national bank. So, the question that's kind of present in this case is, can a state do that? Can they interfere with congressional power? Does the federal government actually have the authority to create a national bank? And if they do, can Maryland tax that bank? Because McCulloch, the guy who is named in the case, he's just basically a cashier at the bank who refuses to pay the tax. Okay. So what happens? And I'm actually going to pull up a website here that's going to help you guys with some of your reviews. You can see my background search there. So McCulloch versus Maryland, this website is called oyez.org. You can go to this website. You can search just about any Supreme Court case you have. It gives you the location. It gives you the year. It gives you some facts, some of the constitutional questions for review. I like that they do this in their conclusion. They touch on every single justice that was present or not present, what the decision was. So you can see here that in McCulloch versus Maryland, we have a unanimous decision. Todd is not present. And this again is the Marshall Courts, or early American courts. And they're going to basically rule that because of the necessary and proper clause, or the elastic clause, like we talked about a little bit yesterday, that the federal government does indeed have the authority to create the national bank. Okay, so that although the Constitution doesn't say they can, it's implied that they can create this, and they'll use the necessary and proper clause to do that. They also say that the supremacy clause, so think supremacy, something supreme, it's higher than, right, or better than, that the supremacy clause gives the federal government power over the states, and therefore Maryland as a state does not have the authority to tax the national bank. Okay? Um, Kind of a big idea there. Anytime you think about one of those early court cases on the Marshall Court, by the way, so think um, along lines of like Marbury versus Madison, that the Marshall Court, if you see his name, is going to basically work to increase federal power, right? He establishes judicial review in Marbury versus Madison. You can see again here in McCulloch versus Maryland, he's expanding federal power through some of his decisions, okay? The other case, which is actually a little bit more interesting, in my opinion, than McCulloch versus Maryland, is United States versus Lopez. And this is where our girl, RBG, comes in here. So in the United States versus Lopez, Congress had passed this act called the Gun-Free School Zone Act. So basically a federal act that says that it's illegal to carry a gun or a concealed weapon knowingly in a school zone. Makes sense, right? You can't bring a gun to school. Um, so Lopez is a student, he's a 12th grader, and he brings a concealed gun into school, a handgun, and he gets caught. So originally he's arrested in Texas. This happens in Texas. He's arrested. He's basically charged by the state. And then the federal government decides to step in and charge him with a violation of this Gun Free School Zone Act. Typically, what will happen is you're probably better off to get charged by your state government than the federal government, because a federal crime is a much more serious offense. So the local charges get dropped, and he's sentenced under this violation of the Gun Free School Zone Act. And this case goes to the Supreme Court, and you might say, why? It seems pretty cut and dry. Why the heck would anybody care? You know, the federal government, he broke the law, right? But what happens is there's this question of constitutionality of the Gun Free School Zones Act. So does the federal government have the authority to create this act? Is that act unconstitutional because it violates the Commerce Clause? And if you go back yesterday, we touched a little bit on the Commerce Clause. Congress has power to regulate business and activities that cross state lines or affect more than one state. But basically, is commerce, right? Commerce is supposed to be businesses and trade and things like that. Um, where do you draw the line for commerce? Is this something that all the states can do? Is this something that can be applied to every state equally? And basically, what happens, you can see here that RBG is kind of faded out because she's in the dissenting opinion, right? Ready to dissent. There's a 5-4 decision by the court, and they actually rule that the act, the Gun Free School Zones Act, is unconstitutional. That the possession of a gun in a school zone is not economic activity, right? You don't bring a gun to school because you're making a trade, unless it's another kind of illegal trade, maybe. But you're not basically applying that clause on the federal government the way it was originally intended. So the court rules that the law is criminal statute, so he obviously cannot bring a gun to school, that should still be legal. He should be persecuted by the state, but that it has nothing to do with commerce or economic activity. So therefore, the federal government does not have the authority to create that law in the first place. Okay. So again, still can't bring guns to school. Bringing guns to school is bad, but it kind of ties in, what does this Commerce Clause actually apply to? Mostly economic activities. All right. And then therefore as well, you could say that that is an example of 10th Amendment reserved powers for the state. The states regulate education. The states make local gun laws and things like that. So obviously after that Gun Free School Zones Act is ruled unconstitutional, it's still illegal in most states to bring a gun to school, right? If not every state. So a couple things here to wrap up this unit. So we can see at the bottom that when it comes to policy making, so policy, think laws, regulations, things like that keep our government functioning, that the three branches of the federal government, the legislative, the executive, and judicial branches, are guaranteed powers through each article of the Constitution, right? Article 1 is the legislative branch, Article 2 is the executive branch, Article 3 is the judicial branch, and they each have a significant job. And we touched on this already a little bit, that the legislative branch, they kind of have an emphasis on finances, they approve budgets, they kind of figure out coining of money, regulation of financial institutions, funding, things like that. The executive branch has powers to take on more of a role in foreign and domestic policy, so the president's making sure that policies created by the legislative branch are being enforced, things like that. The judicial branch is going to kind of serve as that intermediary between the federal government and the state government, settling disputes, ruling on what the government can and cannot do. And that kind of creates this spread out or distribution of power within the federal government. You might say, well, if we're talking about federalism, where do the state governments come in? If you look here, it says states have actually looked in recent years to regain power via legislation designed to limit the scope of federal authority. If you want to think of an example of this, New York State with the SAFE Act, it's a way that this New York State has tried to limit some of the abilities of gun owners that had originally just been deemed as like a Second Amendment issue or a federal issue. So there's new kinds of legislation that are being put in place by states to try to take a little bit more power. Because remember that in the original Constitution, there's nothing that really defines powers of the states. It's more or less just once the Bill of Rights is added, that 10th Amendment, any powers not reserved to the federal government or granted to the federal government in the Constitution are going to be reserved for the states. So it's a little bit vague in that sense, all right? Whereas the national government has a lot more power through fiscal federalism, and basically been able to increase power over time. You could also argue that the president, as his role has increased, right, with social media, with TV coverage, things like that, the president is always, an ever-present individual in the eyes of all Americans, that the president's role gets bigger, which actually allows the president to do more than what his original scope of power might have been. And basically, he's going to do whatever it takes to try to achieve his agenda. So, for example, you think about Donald Trump wanting to build a border wall, things like that. You could argue that the Constitution doesn't give him the authority to build a wall through multiple states' borders. Necessarily, that can be kind of a vague, touchy subject. But as his role and power increases, he's able to get away with doing a little bit more. All right. If you guys have any questions about Unit 1 as you're doing this assignment, please feel free to reach out to me. You should have the chat feature added to Teams. A few of you have actually reached out to me through that, which is great. It'll actually basically send me a text message to my phone. I can respond to any questions you might have. Please, please, please watch these videos. Watch the videos that I've been posting the links to that College Board is doing. Do everything that you can to get yourself ready for this test. All right. And again, if you're looking for this page for the Supreme Court cases, OIAS is what it's called. You can look up any Supreme Court case that you would like. All right. So with that, Notorious RBG and I taking off. Have a good day, guys.